So
12?
technically, you have 15.
15.
If you can do in 10, it's better
Okay.
because we are a little bit delayed.
Yeah.
But I don't want to like.
No, yeah, don't worry. I think I can do it in 10 or 12.
Yeah, 10,
maybe.
12 is fine.
I think, yeah.
Actually.
Okay.
Okay.
After
I will do 18, so
I will give you my time. Don't worry. So after finishing, I can leave, right?
Yes.
Because with the lunch we got a bit
Yes.
late.
Yes.
That's
I will, in this case, because would you be happy to take one or two questions?
yes, please. Yes.
Okay.
Before going.
Michael, because she has to leave after her presentation, we will give her the chance to answer questions before she leaves. Okay.
Okay, no problem.
Sí, tu presentación está ahí. Perfecto.
funciona de forma
Sí,
tal
mira.
se movían, por eso.
Mueve así.
Vale. Nada, vale. Sí, está bien, está bien.
¿Sí?
Si no se
Vale.
mueve.
O sea, ¿tenían que moverse o no tenían que moverse?
Hay una parte que se tiene que mover,
Mike.
pero por lo menos el formato está
You
bien.
don't need
¿no?
the-
Está en formato, está
no,
en
it depends.
PDF.
Whatever you want.
Entonces,
It's fine.
si lo puedes abrir en PowerPoint,
Sí.
So you're not going to use this?
No, I'm not. I
o
will
me
use
dices,
just
o sea,
my.
la pongo yo.
I have
Sí,
my
Simplemente
computer,
la voy
but
a
I don't
dejar
think I will
en el
use.
background, ¿vale?
Vale, genial. ya
Y
está.
tú simplemente cambias del PDF.
Vale, genial. Perfecto, gracias, tío.
Is this working?
Yes. Should be working.
Oh.
So just.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
We're going to wait until Michael is here.
I was just going to do some karaoke until everyone's here.
What did he say? Are you talking with me? Ah, okay. You started. Okay, thank you.
Llegas, saludas y te sobra y te vas. Es así como-
Awesome. Thank you everyone for coming back. We have our second panel of the day coming now on digital epistemologies and challenges. And looking at the lineup for the next few presentations, I think we're going to get some really interesting perspectives from very different places. Kicking us off to start, we have Nuhaila Sufi. Nuhaila has completed her Bachelor in Political Science and International Relations in Muhammad VI Polytechnic University with an Erasmus exchange at URJC in Madrid and a Master's degree in Political Science and International Relations at Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. She worked as a research assistant during 2 years of her master's degree in the field of political science and comparative politics. She's also interned twice in the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies in Qatar. Now, she's a first-year PhD student at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, working on the relationship between national identity and democracy in the Arab world. And just as a note before I hand over to you, with Nuhaila's presentation, we're going to be taking questions immediately after her presentation. So please be taking some notes during the following talk. Nuhaila, over to you.
Hello. Hello to everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us to this conference, to this workshop. And thank you for attending. So today I'm going to present my methodological part of my thesis I'm working on now in my PhD. And I call this part Mixed Methods Approach to Democracy and National Identity in the Arab World. So my study in general seeks to explore the relationship between national identity and democracy in the Arab world, micro-level analysis, which means that I will examine the influence of individual sense of national identity on their perceptions and attitudes toward democracy in the many Arab countries. So my main study hypothesis is that individuals' weak sense of national identity in the Arab countries negatively affects their perceptions towards democracy. I have three main objectives in this research. The first is to quantify or measure the influence of individual sense of national identity on their attitudes towards democracy across the selected countries using data from Arab Opinion Index of 2025. The second objective is identifying the specific dimensions of national identity that influence the most on the attitudes toward democracy. Because as you know, with the complex nature of national identity in Arab countries, the things are different. For example, the first dimension can influence more democracy than the others. The third objective is to compare the pattern of this relationship across the selected Arab countries to see how geography play a role in this relationship. Mainly, we will work on North Africa and the Middle East countries. So to do so, my thesis will employ mixed method approach, which means that we are combining quantitative method with qualitative methods. But it's not just putting things together, but it's it doesn't consist only on collecting and analyzing these two methods in one research, but it's linking the two data sets in one specific design. I got inspired by the explanatory sequential design. Don't know if you are familiar with this kind of design, but it starts with the quantitative data first and the analysis, and then it follows up with the qualitative data. So we will start by analyzing this relationship quantitatively, and when we got the quantitative results and the large results, we will follow up, go with the quantitative interviews, the semi-structured interviews that will help us analyze more and more the quantitative part. So the qualitative data will give us statistically significant and general outcomes, but this qualitative data will explain in depth with personal experience and will give a human side to the human aspect to this statistical results or quantitative results. So for the first methodological part, we will employ the data of the Arab Opinion Index, the last wave, the most recent wave, which is 2025, and this is the largest data or public opinion survey in the Arab world. It's conducted by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Study I worked for during my 2 years in Qatar. So in this wave, we have 15 Arab countries, which are the case studies of my quantitative parts, which are Jordan, Tunisia, Algeria, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Iraq, Palestine, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Egypt, Morocco, Mauritania, Qatar, and Syria, with a total sample of 40,130 respondents. So, to test the study hypothesis, we have to identify first the variables, the study variables. So, I have three main categories of variable. The first one is the dependent variable, which is the attitudes toward democracy. I measure this with the question from the codebook of Arab Opinion Index, which is question 405.6. Democracy has its own problem but remains better than other systems. This is the statement. And people have to say if they agree, disagree, strongly agree, or strongly disagree with this statement. For the independent variables, because in the codebook I didn't find the specific questions asking for national identity, and because national identity has a complex nature in our Arab region, I chose two main questions. The first question is question 701, which measures individuals' opinion on the ties which connect the citizens of the Arab world together, and was expressed as follow. Which of following three broad descriptions of the ties which bind the citizens of the Arab world together is the closest to your opinion? The first one, the weakest among those who perceive Arabs as a single nation, separated by artificial borders. This is the answer one. The second one, which is the moderate level of national identity, among those who claim that Arabs constitute a single nation, even if each people has its own specificities. The third answer, which is the strongest, which is when people affirm the distinctiveness of each people within the same nation, and that Arabs are distinct nations and tied together with only weak ties. This is the three statements. And from this question, we can have or derive a sub-hypothesis for our study, which is individuals who consider Arab peoples are distant nations are more likely to support democracy than those who view Arabs as one nation separated by artificial borders. This is for the first question, or the first aspect. The second question is question 216, which asks the individuals to choose which of two different statements best reflects their opinion. The first statement: the loyalty of citizens to their country supersedes all regional, cultural, political, or professional loyalties, while the second states that despite national loyalty, citizens' regional, cultural, or political loyalty at times of national identity supersede loyalty to their countries. This is two statements. You have to choose if you agree with the first, the second, or if you strongly agree with the first or the second. So this is the second aspect of national identity I identified for this study. So from this question, we can identify another sub-hypothesis, which is individuals who prioritizes national loyalty over regional, cultural, or local loyalties are more likely to express positive orientations toward democracy. This is for independent variables. For control variables, of course, control variables, they are very important in this kind of research because they can influence the dependent variables apart from and regardless of the independent variable effect. I chose four main categories. The first one are demographic variables, which are age, gender, educational level, and then we have socio-economic variables, which includes household level and the national economic situation of the country. Because I don't know if you are familiar with the theory of Seymour Leibset, the economist. He said that the more well-to-do a nation, the greater the chances that it will sustain democracy. So based on that, I chose socio-economic variables. The third category is political attitudes variables, which measure the political interest of people that can also influence their attitudes toward democracy. The last category is religion and religiosity level, which includes the variable of religiosity level and also separation of politics from religion. These are two important aspects. As you know, in the Arab world, the Islam or religion in general is very present, so we have to test this also. To test this hypothesis and to the main research question, I will start with a descriptive statistics work, which will include a table of number of observations we have in all countries, the maximum and the minimum values, the mean value, the standard deviation, etc. And also I will conduct, before going to the micro level analysis, I will start with a macro level analysis, which involves graphs and charts that enable a macro level analysis of the variables related to the sense of national identity as independent variable, and also attitudes toward democracy as dependent variable. So this descriptive statistic would help us organize, summarize, and have a previous or initial picture of this pattern of this relationship at the country level, at the macro level, before going to the micro level. After that, we will go to the correlation test. The correlation test will allow the verification of the strength and the direction, if it is positive or negative, between the dependent, the independent, and the control variables. So it's a very important statistical tool that will summarize the relationship between all variables in one table before going to the regression models. And to do so, we will employ the Pearson correlation coefficient, that will explore the strength and the direction of the relationship, and also the two-tailed test that will be used to test if the relationship between these variables are statistically significant at 0.05 or at 0.01, depends. So this is for the correlation test. After that, we will go to the linear regression analysis, which is the main tool here in our analysis. It will test or verify the effect of independent variables on the dependent variable. It was selected over other types of regression, like binary regression, because I believe that my dependent variable is continuous variable. It's not binary variable 0 1. It's a continuous one. So also I will employ a fixed effects model, specifically because we have many countries, so we have to fix the effects of the country to allow the measure of this relationship while accounting for individual fixed effects relating to each country that specify each Arab context or Arab country. After that, we will. I would like to mention that I will also do a multi-collinearity test that will be relevant to see if there is a problem in terms of correlation, high correlation between independent variables. To do so, I will use the VIF factor, which is variance inflation factor. So to go now to our the main topic of our workshop, the regression results show us the correlation, show us that, for example, the individual sense of national identity influence positively or negatively the attitudes toward democracy. But it doesn't give us the why, the cause, the explanation why. Here, when the qualitative data become important. Here, like I in my research question, I put, for example, can data humanize what data first abstract? What I meant by what data first abstract is that when you put the national identity into a survey with the large-scale numbers, you are reducing the human side, the human aspect of national identity. You are reducing this to just a scale. Strongly agree from 1 to 5, etc. But like this is an abstraction of the human complexity of this identity. That's why I said, can data humanize what data first abstract? Which means that after you have done your quantitative data and you have reduced the identity to a number, can interviews, semi-structured interview, rehumanize what data first abstract? So I think yes, because the qualitative phase does not simply illustrate the quantitative findings, but it interrogates them, and it asks what is lost when national identity becomes a variable and can interviews recover part of that abstraction live out? Because interviews are human voice and human experience. They will allow us to complete the quantitative parts of our analysis. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope I clarified most of the points, and I would be happy to receive your feedbacks, your comments, and your questions. Thank you so much.
Very quickly, because we don't have much time, but any questions?
I'm wondering, so I think this is really interesting. And I'm wondering, as someone who has no expertise in this subject, you talked about integration and this national identity, or maybe even this, I'm not sure if the term is pan-Arab identity, this identity that goes over many nations rather than a single one. I wonder if there is a sub-national identity as well within many of these places. I certainly know that in some of the places I work, people's political and their political allegiance and identity is actually more rooted in a small region of their country rather than the whole thing. Sure. Is that something you expect to find perhaps when you do your qualitative work?
Exactly. Exactly. If you are asking from a qualitative or quantitative point of view, or both?
Both. Is it there or not? And I expect, given that you're working with this Arab Opinion Index, you're limited by what data they've already collected. Yeah. So
okay. So thank you for your question. As I have mentioned before, like the question 216 answers what you have said, because it considers the sub-local identities, because in the Arab world, of course, we have not only the Arabism or the para-Arabism or nationalism. We have also loyalties, other loyalties, the loyalty to the region, the loyalty to the, for example, I don't know, to this leader, or to this sub-country, or because you have a problem in the term of states. Also, we have a problem in the states. We have sub-states, we have fragmented states, and many problems in the Arab world. That's why I considered measuring that with the question 216. If you want, I can repeat it if you want to hear it. It's about the loyalty of citizens to their country supersedes all regional, cultural, political, professional loyalties. Or, despite national loyalty, citizens' regional, cultural, and political loyalties at times supersedes loyalty to their country. So I will test if people prefer national loyalty or other loyalties. If they prefer other loyalties, which means that their national identity is weak comparing to others. But if they prefer national loyalty, it's a good way to say that they have a good level of national identity.
Yes, we'll take a question from an audience member.
Just a little comment.
Of course.
Thank you. Amazing presentation, Sophie. Just a little comment about what you were saying. I'll be careful about that statement that you said at the end, because I think that there's been some context, geographical and historical, in the Arab world, in which a strong national identity has been along with a strong pan-Arabism identity. For example, Egypt during Abel Nasser, or even Syria. So I think it can be dangerous to see as a dichotomy. Like if it's strong, the national identity, the pan-Arabism then is going to be weak. I think it's dangerous to see it as a dichotomy, because sometimes they are going in the same directions. I don't know why. we need to go deeper there.
Yeah. Yes, I agree with you. I agree that every Arab country has its own specificities, of course, related to the history first, like Nasserism, like the nationalism of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or with Al-Assad in Syria. So we cannot reject all that and start from the beginning. But that's why I employed the fixed effects countries, because it fixes the effect of each countries each country. For example, you have characteristic of Iraq. They will be fixed, and we will run this relationship. We will study the pattern of this relationship. And also, that's the importance of the qualitative data, because we are limited with the Arab Opinion Index. We cannot find the more detail, we cannot delve into the details, but with the interviewees, we can. We can ask them that. We can wonder about why, for example, nationalism in Iraq is different from nationalism in Morocco. Or you see, I hope I clarified.
And how have you planned to access to these sources, to these interviews in so many different countries?
Okay, of course, I will not conduct interviews in the 15 countries. That's why I chose the sequential explanatory design that will start with quantitative. And from the quantitative, we will have statistically significant countries. The relationship will not be significant in all countries. We will pick the most significant ones. So when I pick the most significant ones, I will pick at the end 5 or 6 countries, definitive, to go there and to do the interviews. And I will try to find the interviewees that will be experts and politicians and professors. Why not? Like I have connections there in the Arab world, so I think it would not be very hard for me to find them. Thank you.
Okay, we don't have time for more questions, sorry, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you too.
Well,
thank you for your attention.
Joining me on the stage now, we have our second speaker in this Digital Epistemologies and Challenges panel. We have Pedro Aranguez Diaz, PhD candidate at the Private Law Department of Universidad Carlos III de Madrid, and a licensed attorney in Madrid and New York.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, to Juan, to Professor Kernis, and the whole committee. It was very nice to also share the panel with such interesting presentations. The topic I will be talking today is whether we can use LLMs for legal interpretation. And my sub-question within that is, how do the concept of epistemic communities distort or enhance the legal interpretation of LLMs? So when we interpret a legal text, there are some particularities different from other kind of texts that you might be used to dealing with. If we ask an LLM to interpret the law, to interpret a precept, we're asking to do what basically a lawyer would do. There are ambiguous concepts that LLM, that chat, needs to interpret for us to tell us the details of what the rule really means. That's the core task of a lawyer, that text interpretation. So one would think that LLMs might be especially well situated to carry out that task, since they are able to go through the thousands of rules that we actually produce each year in each country. My argument would be that there are actually some very important barriers to legal interpretation without LLMs due to epistemic communities. And I'm going to exemplify this particularly with one rule where I think this is particularly a very strong distortion for LLMs, which is the rule where I'm doing my PhD dissertation about, which is corporate sustainability due diligence. So the concept of epistemic communities means that different groups share a single, a series of traits, including terms, methodology, and goals as the main areas that keep them together. I'm going to put examples. Within the legal world, not only among disciplines that we are different epistemic communities, within the legal world, you do have different epistemic communities. We have, for example, a business and human rights community. These people deal with fundamental rights but apply to corporations rather than states. They talk the language of human rights. The methodology is more social sciences based. So they tend to go more closer to anthropology, many times seeing impacts on the ground, and sociology. So they are closer epistemologically to those disciplines. And as a goal, they believe in the supremacy of human rights as a goal that the law should achieve. Then you have a second epistemic community that is very relevant for this rule that we'll talk about, which is international environmental law. They have very technical terms because the rules are whether our human behavior is impacting the natural world. So they are very skewed towards science. The methodology also goes towards that. So they have what is called contributory interdisciplinary expertise. They don't create really new interdisciplinary expertise. They bring findings from other fields into their own field and explain it for lawyers. And as a goal, they actually believe that we should be focusing on planetary boundaries. So of course, they think all kinds of human rights like child labor or forced labor, it's terrible, but they think there are things that are more urgent in terms of timing, like climate change. So their policy goals are different. And then you have kind of the epistemic community I feel more situated in, which is corporate law, which has a terminology based much on legal certainty. We want security for business, and we want international trade to flow among countries. Our methodology is doctrinal. We don't look at other disciplines. I am weird for being here. My colleague Rafael is also in my department and he's here, but I can tell you where outliers. We don't look at other disciplines. We only look at the text. And sometimes we interpret one text with other texts. We call it situated interpretation. We say this rule must be coherent with other kind of laws we've created. So one could think again that an LLM would be especially good at doing what I'm doing because I'm only looking at text all day long, basically. So What is interesting is that we've created a huge amount of rules that are very ambiguous. And before we even feed it to an LLM, when we feed it to different humans, they interpret the rules very differently. In the particular rule I'm talking about, it basically imposes corporate sustainability rules for very big multinational corporations across the whole global value chain. And the obligation it imposes, they're called due diligence. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, lawyers also do not know. And it depends who do you feed the rule to. They have different opinions on what it should be. I focus particularly on 3 parts of the rule. For example, there is a rule about prioritization, saying that corporations need to care about a whole range of issues, human rights and environment. They have a list of things specifically they need to care about, but they don't have to do everything at the same time. They can focus on one obligation, on one thing, and once that is solved across the global value chain, they can focus on the next. If you ask the human rights people, they think the prioritization they should follow is one thing. If you, for example, child labor, if you ask the environmental law people, they focus on climate or biodiversity. And if you ask the corporate law people, they don't want to see anything prioritized because they think this is a burden for business, at least a very big amount of them. So your situation, your epistemic situation influences quite a lot how you interpret that text. So what was interesting for me was to check what is the epistemic situation, if any, of an LLM. And when you feed the text to the LLM, it's interesting. It tends to give you a very heavily dominated corporate law interpretation of the norm. And of course, it should be, this is an hypothesis, so I'm not carrying out any conclusions here. But in my work in progress, I think it would be very interesting to know, is that because that is the average of what is found in the text? So is the LLM taking a scholarship that interprets the norm and doing an average of how everyone has interpreted the norm, and corporate law scholars are specifically prolific in interpreting this norm? So they speak more about the norm. Therefore, the LLM has more data from corporate law scholars, and that's why the LLM is kind of skewing out that corporate law interpretation of the norm. And could you somehow rebalance that to have a more balanced epistemic community? And unlike other texts which do not have a supreme interpreter, we've been talking today, for example, when my colleague Juan interprets his medieval text, we can all interpret them differently, right? And we can all have different opinions on what that text means. What is interesting about the law for these interpretation purposes is that you do need a supreme interpretation. Not all interpretations are created equal. Eventually, the law will have one supreme interpreter, and the law can designate who that interpreter would be. So in the case of this law, different countries are choosing different kind of enforcers or interpreters. For example, some people are putting corporate watchdogs like Bank of Spain or our people who take care of our capital market supervision. So these are very corporate law focused. Other countries like Norway, they're choosing to put environmental experts to interpret this norm. So the supervision, the lawyers in the government that would interpret this norm in the day-to-day operation would have one expertise of the other, and that would influence what they interpret. So the right interpretation of the norms depend on who do you entrust to interpret the norm. Who and what epistemic community belonging does that person has. So I think that in the case of the LLM, when it feeds me that interpretation back to me as a lawyer, I don't think it's valid at all. So maybe this is a bit of a pessimistic outcome on digital methods, because you cannot take away the human in the legal interpretation. It is vital to the interpretation of that text. The text from the beginning has been created thinking of which human will interpret it, and I think that the machine is way too separated from that. I hope I met your deadline, Juan, but that was. Thank you.
take your questions after.
Thanks. We'll wait to ask questions until we have our next speaker who can join the stage as well. So our third and final panel member for digital methods and epistemological challenges, we have Daniel Rincon Machon. Daniel is a PhD candidate in development studies at the University of Cambridge. His project examines how digital media platforms have reorganized the exercise of armed authority in urban Brazil, focusing on the digital practices of criminal factions and the military police in the city of Fortaleza, Ceará. Drawing on 15 months of ethnographic fieldwork in the Brazilian Northeast, combining participant observation, semi-structured interviews, netnography, and open-source digital research, he argues that access to digitally networked platforms has become a constitutive mechanism of how both state and non-state armed actors identify threats, coordinate action, project violence, and govern marginalized urban communities. His research has been published in the Journal of Peace Research. He is also interested in the ethics of fieldwork in violent settings and in methodological approaches to hybrid physical-digital research in the social sciences. Daniel, I hand over to you.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Well, thank you very much to the organizers and to everyone that is here. This presentation is a first attempt to put together a few ideas on the methodology that I implemented in my research that Michael have very kindly outlined, and specifically one particular question, which is this idea of the hybridity and digital physical entanglements. So basically what I would do is try to go through a few concepts, then a very brief note on ways of knowing, and I will try to give a few key ideas of how did I go about setting up my own project. And I will try to do that before Juan asks me to shut up. Okay, so first main point, and this is kind of conceptual, what I'm talking about, what is this idea of hybridity when it comes to social science methods, and what is this point on entanglements? The question that I'm trying to tackle here, and this is within the conceptual world, is an important question for social sciences in general. That is, what is the relationship between digital and physical social domains? This is a very important question for those that are interested in sociology, anthropology, social sciences in general, because it really determines how we think about many important fields of social life, right? And I will put a few examples based on romantic relationships, mobility, space, and violence, which is my own field of research. So three potential answers for this question on how this relationship is structured ontologically. The first one, these are two different domains of social action, meaning that these two different mediated worlds create different arenas of social action. So this will be the case of RPG video games, right? Think about Minecraft, or the ones of you that are old enough, Habbo and The Sims and so on. Basically, completely different social worlds when people interact with each other in very different ways that they do in the social life. There is space that is constructed, there is relationships that are constructed, there is violence as well that maybe emerge in a more symbolic way, but this doesn't have anything to do with what happened in the physical world. A second possibility that will be epiphenomenality, that the digital is basically a byproduct of the physical world. So this is the way in which many people, and I wouldn't put myself within them, think about social media, right? So what we do in social media is basically representing things that already happen physically. So we put photos of our holidays, our partners, photos of the places that we go or like to go, and well, like political speech, etc. The third point, which is basically the kind of issue that my research kind of like tackles, is this idea of the entanglement, right? So digital and physical domains in our very connected world are intrinsically co-constitutive. So things that happen physically are impacted by digital relationships and the other way around. A few examples: we find our romantic partners in matching in Tinder and in other dating apps. Someone gets fined in a road, put an alert in Waze, and then people that are connected through a digital platform change the course physically in a space where they were going, right? And the specific possibility that I'm going to put forward in here, which is one of the issues I address in my research is the way in which armed actors locally, in this case gangs, use digital forms of representation and social media posts in order to make people do things. So change their behavior and comply with rules of behaviors, right? So this hybrid lens focus on oscillations, let's say, between the physical and the digital world and how do they impact each other. And the methodological question basically is how to capture this oscillation, right? Well, if this is not just me talking, if people is interested in this question and how social sciences, theory, anthropology, and so on have addressed it, these are some interesting books, but just to comply with the time. Just a very quick note on epistemology, and this is something that came up in some of the presentations. There is basically 2 approaches to go through this question, and I am going to talk about mine, which is qualitative, but I'm not making any kind of claims on which is best. People that do this kind of research quantitatively into social sciences just try to understand how much an online event move an offline event or the other way around. So basically making variables and measuring them and measuring causal effects. The qualitative version of this, that will be where I am, try to look at the how and why of these dynamics. So basically trying to understand how does this digital entanglement unfold? So how do people understand it and what are the causal granularity within these kind of relationships, right? Looking at it from a situated perspective from the ground. So let's say that you have a how and why question, and this is my case, and I'm going to introduce a bit like one of the points that I look at in my research. How do you go about it? And well, there is an emerging discussion on this in the social sciences, still very early phases. The main books that have been written trying to tackle these kind of questions are from the 2020s. So still very on the making. My own contribution is just trying to think about open source research methods in these designs. And I will try to simplify this very briefly. If people is interested, we can talk about more in the Q&A. My workflow very kind of like schematically is this. What I propose is that in order to understand this kind of entanglements, it's interesting to start by mapping, and these open source intelligence methods are helpful to do so. And I will discuss more about what that means later. That kind of maps the ground, actors, channels are important, and so on to immerse. So that is qualitative fieldwork, and I will talk about more about that after that. And then there is an iterative continuous phase between those two until reaching empirical saturation. So yeah, like this is my case, and this is the question that I'm going to use as an example of these 3 phases. I did 15 month fieldwork in Fortaleza, which is the city, northeastern Brazil, extremely unequal, urban peripheries controlled by 2 kind of armed groups, military police with acts mainly extra-legally, and the criminal factions, which is a kind of criminal group in Brazil. And the question that I took to the field was basically how digitalization have impacted the way in which governance is structured in these violently contested areas. And in particular, one of the questions that came out of this, which is the one that I'm going to discuss now, is how do criminal groups use digital media to enforce social order in this context? The first thing that I did was mapping. So basically, before even going to the field, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, well, time flies, I started mapping different digital channels that were circulating information on urban violence in this specific region, using different techniques that are associated with open source research, which is basically a group of techniques that were developed by investigative journalists mostly, also some human rights organizations, in order to access and verify information online in open sources, so social media and so on. There is techniques that I can talk about, but I will move through this briefly for the sake of time. Second point that I did with this information was trying to map actors. So which kind of actors was this content referring to? What is the symbolic world of these actors? So keywords, numbers, colors that are repeated, and so on. Physical spaces are referenced in the content. So which are the areas that are under conflict? How do the different actors talk about it? And in general, just trying to draw patterns in this information that was actually very helpful to go on fieldwork and understanding what to ask, right? And this is kind of like the big catch of this first phase, trying to understand how to go through the physical fieldwork after. Most of this pattern making was basically tabulation, so this is how the thing looks. Just going through a huge spreadsheet and making a lot of notes, classifying, reclassifying, and so on. Everything very inductive. Okay, yeah. And through this process of open source investigation, this is one of the things that came out. So there was one specific pattern that was that these gangs were producing a lot of content, apparently flashing weapons, showing territorial presence, and basically showing people that they were present or active in a specific place. At this point, I couldn't say much about this if I had left things here. And this is one of the main methodological points, which is we cannot make inferences about what this kind of content means if we don't ask questions to the people that live in those situations to understand what is the function that they play. It's like, if we just take this could mean anything, right? Like they could just be showing things and then not doing anything on the ground. So that's what they did, basically. The second point was this immersion across both spaces, both physical and digital. So I was spending a lot of time in places, in the specific communities in Fortalezas that were controlled by one of these groups. Original approaches to some scholars focus on the idea of trying to follow the same people both physically and digitally. This is something that I couldn't do beside the very obvious security implications, also because most of this content is anonymous, so I couldn't know who was posting. So I had to follow different strategies. One of them, a lot of semi-structured interviews with different people, residents of this area, some GAN members, and in general, people that have knowledge on this matter. Ethnography as well, which is different than open source research. This was mostly about spending a lot of time in specific digital channels and understanding how did communication unfold, who posted, why, and so on, interviewing owners of digital channels. Also documents and archives. For example, I took a lot of information from specific judicial cases and police files about these groups. And then things started to take shape, right? Through these interviews, and I just put two example there. People started contextualizing this kind of digital post and what did they mean in the specific context of the very Fortaleza, right? In this case, what GAN members were pointing at is that this was a strategy that they used to show people that they were powerful and to make them scared and to show them that they should not break the rules, which in this context mainly means to talk with police or with rivals, which will be very dangerous for the gang because then they will be displaced. And for residents, they were actually telling me that this was something important that they will look for in order to understand if conflict was impending, and that was something that made them believe on the gang in this sense. That's an expression that they used, like desacreditar. So through iteration, that was the final argument on this specific point in my thesis, right? That content production in this context was a fear maximization strategy. So basically all violent groups, and this is a discussion in the literature, need to use a certain amount of coercion in order to maintain social order. Otherwise, people would not comply with rules. So this is a way of having to use less coercion and also achieve the same effect because coercion is expensive and attract police informants and so on. So yeah, more implications. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will be very happy to talk about all these, and I think that these are very important. First, ethics and consent. So how do you achieve informed consent in online settings? Do you need consent to observe open source content? How do you ensure that there is no harm when reproducing images? Safety also, and I'm not talking about just like safety in the field physically, but also digitally. So what do you do when you encounter very violent digital content, a potential of trolling, or basically people trying to talk to you? Also representativeness, right? Like things that happen online normally are viral and overrepresented. So what are you letting out if you focus on digital content? And just a brief takeaway, and I think that I am on time, Juan. So if social life is entangled across digital and physical spaces, which is the case in our society increasingly more, the method has to function in both places at once. So yeah, thank you very much.
Pedro, if you want to join as well. So, because we are short in time, we are going to take two questions, one for Pedro and one from Danny. And then we're going to have a short break of like 10 minutes and then come back. So yes, if anyone has any question, go ahead. First one, Rafael. Yes. Sorry.
Hi. So this is a question for Pedro, as you might have imagined. First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Danita, as well. You mentioned that you had basically fed an LLM a concept that you wanted interpreted to see what would come out. And I was just wondering which LLM you tried out. And sorry, so there's a second part. In case it was a closed source LLM, have you considered trying it out with an open source LLM where the training data might have been a bit more transparent? Because this might help you confirm or deny your hypothesis that the training data may be the source of a problem. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That's a great remark. I've used Claude and ChatGPT. I think Claude is far superior for law in everything. I mean, that's based on my personal observation alone. Don't use AI as your lawyer. And I agree, this is for the future to choose the training data that, it will be key. I think it will be amazing to choose an open source. I understand that you can choose an open source and also codify it based only on the training data you want. Am I wrong about that? Like I can make the answers depend only on the sources that I choose, right?
I think sort of, yeah. I'm I'm not an expert myself, but I think there's some LLMs where you at least have more transparency on how they were trained, and you might even have access to the original training data set. And by that, you could check if, for instance, there's a large amount of corporate law reviews that have been absorbed, or more business human rights or more international environmental law. Whereas with Claude or OpenAI products, I think you have almost zero visibility into what actually went in, except the scandals you hear, but apart from that.
Thank you. That would be a very interesting way forward. I think that would be very nice to know exactly how it responds fitting into different communities. That's great. Even different languages.
Okay, second question, if anyone has it, for Danny.
Yeah, thank you both for your presentation. It was very, very interesting. And I wanted to ask you, Daniel, a couple of things. First, in a context, digital environments where engagement sometimes means, like engagement is what many of these organizations or groups are looking for. Does it pose any sort of conflict to follow them, interact with those pages, and give them visibility? How do you, because I feel your work touches on a anthropological level of you're interacting with the same communities that you want to study, right? Does it ever feel like you're influencing what they do because you're watching, you're asking them, and maybe you're not seeing how it is when you leave? Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, is that
the yeah?
Yeah, right. So I think that there are two spaces and two answers, right? Digitally speaking, not really, because my approach was what one of the scholars that is writing on this, that is called the surname is Urbanic. They talk about the mirror glass window approach, which basically is that I'm observing online, but I'm not really interacting online. And I am just limiting myself to open massive Telegram groups, social media, and so on, where my presence wouldn't be more complicated than the presence of many others that were in those groups, including police, journalists, and so on. So in that sense, I was confident that what I was observing online was not affected by my own presence. Personally speaking, I mean, like that's the key thing of ethnographic research and qualitative research in general, right? Like, how do you know that the fact that you are the person asking the questions is not biasing or affecting the way in which people is replying to you? And I mean, short question, you cannot know. And in that sense, if that is a standard, then any kind of qualitative research is biased. there are many ways in which you can triangulate and discuss things with very different people. So, for example, I wouldn't take the answer of I was talking with the military police and with residents of these neighborhoods about police violence. So you would take 2 data points, then you would use things to triangulate, right? News sources, content in open sources, and so on, and you will make a statement on what do you think that is robust and what do you think that was the different ways in which they wanted to present themselves. And at the end, that's a subjective decision in a way, but I just think that when you code a variable, you probably make the subjective decisions the same way. So at the end, like everything is subject to a certain degree of variability.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're gonna have a short break until past, and we'll be back.
Hola.
Second. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much again. Let's start with the last panel of the day. On time this time. Yeah. Well, thank you very much again for the organization, for the Seneca Institute and the Carlos III University to be organizing all this, in which I hope will be the first of many others. It is a pleasure to be organizing a panel in what was my alma mater. I did my bachelor's in here, so it's great to be back, but also a bit terrifying given that I have taken so many exams in this actual building. So some memories were building. But yeah, let's go straight to the panel, which is going to have a lot of interesting things on LLMs and how to use them. Our first presenter is Juan Piñón del Río. Juan holds a BA in International Relationships and Economics from the Universidad Rey Juan Carlos de Madrid, and a Master in Contemporary Arab and Islamic Studies from the Autonomous University of Madrid. He has also taught international relationships and at Universidad Rey Juan Carlos, and he is currently a second-year PhD candidate in Contemporary Arab and Islamic Studies at the Autonomous University of Madrid. His research interests engage with sectarian dynamics, geopolitics, colonialism, and identity formation in the Middle East. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation and for organizing this amazing seminar. I'm very happy to be here. All of the panels that has spoken before has been amazing. I will try to do my best to be at your level. Sorry in advance for my English. If something is unclear, please interrupt me and I will try to explain with different words. I'm working still on it. Okay, so what I bring here is part of my research. I'm going to simply explain the possibilities and challenges that I have found in one of the lines of my research. And first of all, I'm going to explain you my thesis and the line of research in which I'm working with LLMs tools. And then I'm going to explain in more detail the different phases in which I use these LLMs tools and what challenges I found and what possibilities and solutions I found too. And I'm going to skip this part because I have too many slides. So, okay, what are my research interests? As soon as I enter into the Arabic and Islamic studies, I found very interested why and how does the sectarian identities has become so prevalent in the political arena of different scenarios of the Middle East. You can see there are some examples: Iraq, Lebanon, Iran, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. If you know a little bit about Middle East, you will find that it is true that in these countries, religious has entered very deep into politics, and a lot of political parties are based on religious orientations or have religious programs, and there is a important relation between the sectarian identity and the political identity of the population. So I start to ask why these sectarian identities has become so prevalent instead of others that were more important in other times, such as class, ethnicity, ideology, national belonging. I chose Bahrain and I bring a map because Bahrain is a very small archipelago that maybe if you're not familiar with the region, you don't know where is it, but it is just here. This is a small group of islands close to the east coast of Saudi Arabia and very close to Qatar too. And it's an interesting scenario. I cannot explain why, but let me give you a little bit of background for you to understand the later part of my research. It's interesting that these islands were habitated for sedimentarian people. Can I say sedentarian people? Sorry. And at the beginning of the 18th century, some Arab tribes who were Sunna from the middle of the Saudi Arabia, from here, from the Najd, started to migrate it to these islands. Depending on the narrative, you can read that they migrated. Other people say they invaded. Other people will say they conquer. So this is part of the competition of the narratives. But the important thing is that this creates a situation in which there were an equal distribution of the resources of the proto-state, and the Sunna, who were the conquering groups, access to the control of the resources, and the Shia, who were the people that lived before, felt a part of these positions of power. And during the colonialism, this became very politicized through some mechanisms such as citizenship and the resources that also put a community, make able to the communities to become larger, to become more conscious that they are a community, such as newspapers, social media, and this kind of stuff. So at the end, what we have now today is a very hard competition of narratives in the countries. I googled this yesterday on my home, Shia and Bahrain, simply on Google, and you can see that all of the news that you receive are related with the discrimination of the Shia in Bahrain. Sometimes about the withdrawal of the citizenship of the Bahraini people, or the Khalifa, who are the rulers, attacking the festivals, the religious festivals of this sect. And always the Khalifa, the rulers, treat this topic as a taboo, as if there weren't exist this distribution of sects, like there were no difference between Sunna and Shia. All of we are Muslims. But this is what some authors, such as Fanar Haddad, define it as a counterproductive taboo, because don't talk about it seems that you are hiding something, or that it is true that you have an interest in hiding that Sunna groups are or not in the positions of power. So I tried to do it in a more academic way to find out if it is true that there are some relations between some positions of the state, especially the elite, and some classification of the sects or the ethnic groups. If some ethno-sectarian groups are in the position of powers, and what groups are not. Okay, and here is where enters the LLMs. At the beginning, I needed to try to create just as simple as a surname list, in which I put the main surnames of Bahrain and classify them in different ethno-sectarian categories. For example, those that you can see here are those groups, those families who went with the Khalifas during the conquest of the 18th century. So this is the classification. Okay, here the LLMs didn't were helpful, and because they didn't have access to bibliography, and I only could do this with bibliography, but it was really helpful with the part of the transliteration variants. Because all of the surnames, for example, if you take this row 6, Albu I9, you can see how, in this case, ChatGPT put the different variants of the terms that can be written in English from the Arabic, and this is going to be very useful when I do the matching with the elite datasets. And that's the second part. The second phase was to build this elite dataset and to see how is the composition of the elite of Bahrain. At this moment, I've been working on 3 datasets. The first 2 of them are very easy to build, and at the beginning, I tried to create all of these datasets with LLMs, but it failed in all in all of the three datasets. I don't know why, because for example, Council of Representatives, what I wanted to do is to have a list with all of the members that have been in the lower chamber of Bahrain since the beginning, and I put the link in ChatGPT. Pick the info from here. Apparently it was easy, but he wasn't able, so I need to do by myself. The same happened with Sura Council, and with senior institutional pods is more difficult, because here I want to have a list with all of the directors, board, and senior officials of different strategic public entities. So it's a much longer data set and much more difficult to get. Again, he wasn't able to do it, and I thought that maybe it was because my instructions weren't clear. So I asked ChatGPT to give a more clearly command to Cloud, and to try to do it with Cloud Premium, and he wasn't able to do it again. And the list were incomplete. Some surnames were twice. It wasn't a clean job. So I needed to do it by myself, but it doesn't mean that it didn't help. Because it was very useful, especially in this part, in converted some of the, because I'm going to show you for the third data set what I wanted to do. These are the main public institutions of Bahrain. One good thing of Bahrain is that they are very good in electronic governance, and they have a lot of information on internet. So if you take, for example, Ministry of Works, and you want to see the which people are the mayors and the directors of this public organization, you go here, organization chart, and you will find out that this is an image. So it will have been a very slow process to write it down, every name, and also I could make some mistakes because it's more or less 100 of public institutions. So it's a lot of time putting the profile, the name, so I could make some mistakes. And the good point is that I could copy the image, paste on ChatGPT, and it transform these awkward layouts into a clearly and easy to copy paste rows to Excel. And it was helpful with Arabic language, with images, with PDFs, because every different institution have different layouts in their web page. And also there is something interesting that ChatGPT has access to some of the institutions that my computer doesn't have access. I don't know why. I have always the problem of 403 block. So, but ChatGPT could. Anyway, I'm not using this information because I cannot verify it if he gets in a right way. Okay, thank you. But it's interesting I will see how to use it. This is more or less the result of what I was telling you. This is the people of the Ministry of Works, and thanks to ChatGPT, he does a really fast and good result, much quicker than if I have done by myself. Then I need to match the data sets that I got with my surname list, and in this part is where LLMs were more efficient and were more helpful, because, for example, with some tools of Excel, such as Search X, Buscar X, that we usually do, you cannot do it because of the transliteration variants, because every surname is written differently in the different translations from the Arabic to English. But in this thing is very good ChatGPT, and also it can assign confidence to the maths. So this is an example of the Excel that I got comparing my surname list with the list of the director of the public institutions. And you can see, for example, that there are some cases, Al Khalifa. Al Khalifa is clearly the same surname that the canonical item, that the surname that I have in my list. But there are others. Sada is always yes, strict match. But there are others. Al Mudaifa, strict match, no. But it's a probable match, Al Mudaifa, because in my list was written differently, Mudaifa. So when I do the verification, I see it and I say, okay, I put a yes. And LLMs is always very good in giving some easy and quicker statistical results, because this is very visual. It gives this in just a second, and is basically what I'm looking for. At this moment, the percentages are very low because I'm still working on my surname list that needs to be much extended to have value, but is what I'm working on. Well, there are some risks and some ethics that I ran out of time, but it is true that you can have a surname and then change of your religious affiliation from Sunna to Shia, and I continue it wrongly. So I will work on this ethics and risk, and that's all. Thank you. This is it.
Okay. So we take the questions at the end? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Perdona, sí,
Okay. Amazing. Thank you very much, Juan. Our next presenter is Ismael García Cáceres. Ismael graduated in International Studies and History and Politics at Carlos III University, and he is currently completing a master's degree in History of the Spanish Monarchy at Complutense University of Madrid. He undertook academic exchanges at the City University of Hong Kong, Universidad de Sao Paulo, and University of Antwerp. He has been awarded a grant to pursue a PhD at the European University Institute in Florence, starting this September, where he will study the health of the slaved rovers in the Mediterranean galleries in the early modern periods. He's particularly interested in digital methods and has an extensive knowledge of digital tools. Yeah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm very happy, very excited to be here. It is quite a pleasure. Carlos III University was my home for 7 years, so it is quite a pleasure to be here. Honestly, thank you very much for the organizing committee. Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Michele. So I'm a historian. I'm the only historian here, I think, in these panels. In particular, in early modern history, this is 16th to 18th centuries. That is to say, I work with documents, all documents. These are my primary sources. And historians sometimes are reluctant to use digital tools, to use data. So what I present today may not be very spectacular. However, they show that we historians can use data and can use digital tools. So my topic is, well, the title of my presentation, Digital Methodologies. I didn't start this. How can I? Yeah, sorry. So digital methodologies for the study of Mediterranean galley slavery in the 17th century. So first, I would like to, before talking about Mediterranean slavery, I would like to place AI in a broader historical perspective, because as I said, I am a historian. So several scholars have argued that generative AI may become what economists call a general purpose technology. So these kind of technologies have effects that go beyond one single sector. They transform the way people work, the way people communicate, and the way people produce knowledge. And some historical examples would be steam engine, electricity, computers. And my point here is that the AI can be considered a new GPT. It is spreading across many sectors, and it is generating new forms of innovations and new application. Whether we like it or not, and this is my point, AI is going to transform the way we historians conduct and humanists conduct research. So we have to be open to use kind of digital tools, even AI, in our production, in our research. Then we move to the core of my presentation, Mediterranean slavery. I would like to introduce it. The historian Salvatore Bono, who is an Italian historian, estimated that between the 16th and 18th centuries, about 2.5 million enslaved people lived in Europe, the vast majority of them within the territories of the Spanish monarchy. Despite the significance of the Mediterranean slavery, historians have generally devoted more attention to Atlantic slave trade. And my research focuses specifically on galley slaves, that is, the men who rowed the galleys, the driving force of the galleys. And to understand their living conditions, it is important to consider that between 150 and 350 rowers were confined in a very small place. They were exposed to cold, to poor hygiene, to disease such as tuberculosis, tetanus. They were also exposed to work-related illnesses such as back pain, hernias, skin disease, and that medical care on board was very limited, especially for those slaves. So what I did is, my research is based on 10 slave lists belonging to the Genoese assentistas, the Genoese kind of contratists that are in the Archivo General de Simancas. These documents were compiled between 1612 and 1643 by crown officials, by contadores and veedores, whose role was to supervise the activities of the galleys. So my methodology combines quantitative and qualitative approaches. This is an example of one of the records. This case is a simple record. There are more complex records. This Ali from Argel, son of Ahmed. He entered on the 1st of October 1622. So this is just to show you how these documents are. The core of the project is a database containing information on more than 1,700 enslaved individuals. I recorded a lot of variables. Some of them are the name of the slave, the place of origin, the age, the date of entry, the date of exit. Overall, the database consists on 71 variables, more than 1,700 records, and approximately 40 additional worksheets used to present the calculations and the analysis I show here today. One important issue here is that the database had to address a lot of methodological challenges that I found in the primary source. For example, this is just one example. There are individuals that appear twice in my primary sources because they would transfer from one galley to another galley. So those individuals appears once in the first galley and then a second time in the second galley. So I had to identify those individuals according to their physical description and produce a single record, because if not, I would count those individuals twice. So that needed complex formulas. And this is one of the ways of using AI in my research. I used AI to obtain these complex formulas that allowed me to kind of handle these kind of methodological issues that I can comment specifically because I don't have time. This is some of the results. I just want to comment very quickly. I got an average age at entry into the galley of 29.5 years and an average age at exit of 40%. The key result here is that this is not a young age for early modern age. This is actually an adult age. And about the length of stay, what I obtained is that the minimum average length of stay is 7.42 years. However, I would need to increase, due to some methodological issues, I would need to increase this duration to between 9 and 10 years, which is in any case shorter than what was previously estimated by other studies. One of the most important questions concerns mortality. I got a mortality rate of 30% for those years, and other scholars have obtained similar results for specific years. Well, actually not similar results, but they obtain kind of figures for specific years, which is actually not very useful because mortality can be very regular. With like 1 year can be completely different to the next year. So what I was really interested in was the temporal perspective, how mortality was over time. What this graph does is it relates deaths with the months in galley service. And what I obtained is that 26% of those who did it before the end of the second year. So these results suggest that the first years in the galleys were particularly lethal and represented the period of greatest vulnerability for enslaved rowers. Then I moved to this second part of my presentation, which is how to visualize the origin of slaves, because I mentioned before that my primary sources include the place of origin of these slaves. It's true that they contain the old name of the place of origin, so I had to do some kind of research to obtain the modern place of origin. But in any case, I used this software KHIS, which was mentioned before, I think, in one presentation. This allowed me to show the origins of the slaves across Mediterranean region, covering territories of the Spanish monarchy, the Ottoman Empire, and Morocco. And what we can see clearly that the largest group came from Algeria, followed by the Ottoman province of Anatolia and the Regency of Tunis. Taken as a whole, the Maghreb was by far the principal source of slaves for the Genoese galleys, accounting for more than 60% of all the individuals recorded in the sample. And this is actually important because these represent an important historical shift. During the 16th century, so the previous century, the majority of the slaves came from Greece or from the Anatolia. So this was the main source of slaves. However, by the early 17th century, so what I'm studying, the Maghreb had taken its place. Another aspect that I wanted to study was the transfers. I mentioned before that slaves were transferred between galleys. They could be transferred between galleys of the same asentista, the same contractor, for example, Spinola, or to galleys of other contractor, for example, Doria. However, scholars have not yet been able to determine the criteria that led to these transfers. And I wanted to get deeper into these transfers, and I thought about a way of visualizing this, and I used generative AI to obtain the code to learn how to use RStudio and to produce this graph that allow me to see graphically how these transfer occurred. And it's true that I still don't know the criteria that led to this transfer. I have 3 hypotheses. The first one is that the most experienced slaves might have been transferred to other galleys to help resolve group conflicts inside the galleys. Secondly, the second possible hypothesis is that it's actually the opposite, that problematic individuals were removed from the galley to break their social ties, their group solidarities, so that the captains could avoid rebellions or could avoid escapes from the galleys, which were quite common. And the third hypothesis, which is quite reasonable, that the captains could organize group transfers to reinforce other galleys. We can actually apply the same methodology to use generative AI to obtain code to get deeper in the mortality, the mortality analysis. We can calculate the survival rate thanks to this exploratory method, the Kaplan-Meier curve, which relates the survival rate in the vertical axis and the length of stay in the galley, the years of stay in the galley in the horizontal axis. And what we can see is that survival rate decreases over time, but there is always a chance of surviving, which is actually one of the conclusions of my research. So some conclusions. The enemies of the faith was the main source of slaves. 9 out of 10 came from the Ottoman Empire or Morocco. The second conclusion is that the average length of stay was between 9 and 10 years, which is in any case less than suggested by other studies. Third, that the galley slave was, at Bernard Vincent stated, un hombre en la plenitud de su vida. Almost 60% of those entering and 90% of those leaving were over 25 years old. On mortality, our study finds that the initial months were critical for survival. However, once the 2-year mark was passed, a less bad probability of survival, while always bearing in mind that the risk of death remained high. And finally, that not all individuals remained in service until they died. Captains prevented the slaves from dying on board and preferred to transfer or release them beforehand so that they could continue to make use of the slaves outside the galley. On AI methods, I want to comment some few remarks. I didn't show a very complex, very sophisticated methodology. However, I wanted to show that we historians can use digital tools, digital methodologies, and even also AI. However, I have some pessimistic conclusions. I know we're not here to be pessimistic about AI, but it is true that my empirical observations during my master this year, I was a master student. Master students are massively using AI to read, to write, to summarize, to construct arguments, which is actually this is key in this is essential in the cognitive process. So this could lead to some kind of cognitive corruption. We will see what happened to this. And we can also see some kind of opportunistic behaviors in academia. So researchers and students who make intensive use of AI can produce outputs more quickly and in greater quantity than those who do not. Maybe less quality, greater quantity, less quality. But this is creating competitive asymmetries in academic environment that I think we should reflect on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ismael. And now we go with our last presentation of the day, which Rafael Berman is going to present. Rafael is a first-year PhD candidate in law at the University Carlos III of Madrid. After studying law in Germany, France, and the UK, he worked briefly for a corporate law firm and an environmental law NGO in Berlin. He is now pursuing his PhD with a project focused on the relationship between the law and sustainability risk, in which he ultimately strives to determine whether the law is adequate considered and handling sustainability risks such as the growing climate risk. In this context, he is exploring how he could leverage the enormous potential of AI and natural language processing to aid his research and to develop new methodologies for legal research. Having a predominantly legal background with significant computer science or without significant computer science or linguistic experience, his presentation would also serve to highlight how comparatively easy it has been to get started with natural language processing in a variety of applications. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the organizers for organizing this event, and thank you to the audience for staying till so late. And I'll try to keep it brief so we don't have to stay any longer. So before we start, some very brief disclaimers. So what I will be presenting is still very much a work in progress and notably still needs to be evaluated. And I've approached NLP and AI in general was sort of a tinkering approach. So I'm still rather new to the whole field. And my approach was to try out various things, trying various code scripts, various methods, and mainly to explore whether I can use these methods for my own PhD. And I so far relied and still very heavily rely on coding assistants to translate my ideas into functioning and running code, and which is what I refer to as vibe coding here. And moreover, I currently do not have any dedicated funding for my PhD, so I'm trying to deploy my approach as cheaply as possible and also as open source as possible. That being said, let's get right into it. So within the context of my PhD, I set it out to teach myself how to deploy NLP techniques. And as a sort of learning by doing project, I decided to try to automate the manual analysis that some researchers conducted of a paper that sits right at the heart of what I'm trying to investigate for my PhD. So these researchers from the LSE basically investigated what banks were disclosing regarding climate litigation risks. And they did that by taking around 20 annual reports of European banks and processed them manually along a questionnaire. So they were, for instance, asking how does the bank define climate litigation risk or legal risk? And they did this manually. They went through the documents and then periodically discussed their results to find agreements. And if you imagine that as very painstaking and very time-intensive work, you would be exactly right. And I thought the same. And to me, this type of workflow seemed like a prime candidate for using AI to automate it, to speed it up, and also potentially to scale it up. And at the same time, I was researching the current state of the literature regarding NLP in the realm of corporate and especially sustainability disclosures. And I found that some researchers in Zurich had developed a rather straightforward methodology to analyze so-called corporate climate transition plans, which is how corporations disclose how they plan to adapt to climate change and other societal changes. And for that, they use a technique called retrieval augmented generation. And so we don't lose anyone, in case someone doesn't know. Retrieval augmented generation, or RAG for short, is a common technique that is used to address some of the common shortcomings that LLMs come with. For instance, that they tend to hallucinate, they tend to struggle with long context, so big amounts of information at once, also being limited in how up-to-date their training data was. RAG addresses this by forcing the LLM to generate its answers based only on that additional information that was not included in its original dataset. So in a nutshell, my initial idea was to sort of automate what the people from the LSE did by using the Zurich researchers' approach. By adapting the approach to a slightly different task, and also importantly to my resource constraints, because these Zurich researchers appear to have a lot of funding and access to frontier AI models, which I, for the moment, do not. So some first attempts proved rather promising, but a bit limited in the quality of the answers. And originally I thought this was all due to the generation model I'm using, which turned out to be a rather naive conclusion, and which will lead me also to how I've decided to upgrade my RAG framework. And I've decided to upgrade it based on two papers, mainly to upgrade the retrieval stage, which I will now explain in a bit more detail. So apologies first, this was meant to be in animations and not to, to throw you the whole slide at once. But here we go anyway. So now that you have a rough idea of what I'm trying to achieve, here's a brief, I hope, breakdown of my current RAG pipeline. So we start off by taking a bank report. If you've never seen one, they tend to be PDFs of, in Europe at least, let's say 400 pages. Full of tables, full of figures, full of also descriptive text. That is not by far not everything important. So we have to clean up this document. So we then start off with a so-called pre-processing stage, in which we clean up the document to make it more easily handleable by machines. This includes deformatting tables, extracting the text, cleaning it up with its weird formatting, and also importantly, cutting up the text in smaller chunks. We then continue by deploying a so-called embedding model that, in a nutshell, transforms the text chunks into numerical representations of themselves. And this allows us, in a subsequent step, to measure their meaning, numerically measure their meaning in context, which is essential for the subsequent retrieval stage. And so to recap on this first stage of pre-processing, we now have our PDF annual report that was cut up, cleaned up, and also embedded into a numerical version of itself. And we can now move on to the RAG's, I would say, characteristic feature, which is the so-called retrieval stage. And at this stage, we want our code to search and select the chunks of a document that are the most relevant for the task at hand we wanted to address. In other words, we need to retrieve the chunks of the document that will contain the information needed to answer the questions we want to ask. And there are a few ways you can go about it. And in my case, I'm using 3 different methods to hopefully get the best retrieval performance possible. So first, I want to keep in mind or picture that we have our cached questions in an Excel sheet that our code can access, along with some explanations and definitions that clarify the question scope and what we're trying to answer. And this also allows us to use the questions to guide the retrieval process. So our first retrieval method is fairly obvious. We use keywords that are derived from the questions. For instance, litigation, climate risk, climate litigation, stuff like that, to select relevant chunks based on how frequently these keywords appear in the chunks. This is a good initial filter and gets us a lot of important chunks, but it's still rather limited and typically misses a lot of the nuance you would need for especially legal text or legal terms. And the second method thereby addresses precisely that shortcoming by retrieving chunks based on their semantic similarity to the questions, which is determined by measuring the similarity between the embedded chunks and the questions that we also have embedded, especially for that purpose. This often does produce pretty good results, but it may sometimes still retrieve chunks that, though they are semantically similar, do not really help in answering the question at hand. And to try and address this, I'm using a third method, which is a bit less straightforward, but in a nutshell, it relies on an LLM generating an hypothetical or even ideal answer to the question I'm trying to answer. The idea is that this ideal answer may provide a richer semantically representation of the information the model needs to find. So in a sense, you're giving it an ideal answer, and the model looks for the closest thing to it. So after running those 3 retrieval methods, imagine we have a list of chunks that the 3 paths determine to be the most relevant. But some of these chunks may be more directly relevant than others. For instance, some may be less directly relevant, and for instance, only provide some essential context, but not directly answer the question. And moreover, we may also want to give, for instance, the keyword approach or the semantic approach more weight than of the other retrieval approaches. And to address this, we ask another model, in this case, a re-ranking model, to re-rank the chunks based on certain criteria to hopefully guarantee that only the most relevant chunks are eventually being fed to our last generation model. And for instance, we can also apply cutoff limits of, for instance, only the top 5 relevant chunks eventually make it through. So after all this, we hopefully have all of the most relevant chunks of the report that we need to answer the questions. And we can then move on to the final generation stage, the actual answering of a question. To this end, we formulate a prompt, which includes our questions, the chunks we just retrieved, and along with some additional information or definitions we want the generation model to follow during the generation. Currently, I'm using a DeepSeek model, mostly because it's open source and quite cheap to run. And it then produces an answer to our questions. And it's time to take a look at what the output looks like. So I mainly included these 2 Excel screenshots to give you an idea of what it produces. No need to read it. It basically gives us, on the one hand, a verdict if the answer could be answered or no, if the content was found, and also a reasoning in which it details based on what chunks and what information the model based its answer. So the results are decent overall, but could definitely be improved. I think this is probably the main the main conclusion so far. For instance, some answers are rather correct, but do miss nuance. And if you were to only rely on the answers without reading the actual report yourself, you would get the wrong impression. And there's also some other outputs which are a bit more worrisome. For instance, the model, or rather the pipeline, tends to miss rather obvious indications of explicit information, which is highly worrying. And it's still an open question as to why that might be. It might be that the retrieval stage is failing entirely because the text is still weirdly formatted and the retrieval process cannot find the relevant information, even though for us as a human, it may be open in plain sight in the document. And this is currently where I'm sat at. I'm currently trying to evaluate my approach and to improve it. So there's 3 evaluation approaches that I see, at least relevant for me, and they will all follow the same principle. in evaluation, that context would mean to compare the performance of my setup against a so-called benchmark dataset, and thereby determine whether the modifications I eventually make to my codes improve or decrease its performance, although while tracking the tweaks and the outcomes in a more standardized manner than I'm doing currently. So the first potential strategy would be the ideal approach, even though it does also come with certain caveats. Ideally, I would compare the output of my AI approach to the original data set of a human paper, because essentially is what I'm trying to replicate. And this would provide the most direct and the strongest benchmark possible to see whether the machine can replicate the researcher's approach. And however, the data set is currently not publicly available. I'm hoping to get it, but it's not guaranteed. And moreover, the researchers coded the dataset manually and in vivo. So its structure may not be ideally suited to what my code currently produces. So I may have to change my code to be able to evaluate it with that dataset. Option 2 is probably the most straightforward, but also by far the most labor and time intensive. The idea would be to create my own evaluation dataset by manually processing a bunch of annual reports myself. But as you can imagine, this is going to take me ages. If this is something I could immediately get started with, and which also leave me with a new data set that I can use for further purposes, for instance, to fine-tune models. But aside from the high resource intensity, I may also introduce personal biases in the data and analysis during the processing stages. And being a human, I also risk producing inconsistent data. And the third strategy is a bit uncertain, but also has its attractive points. So it would be to use so-called synthetic data. Some approaches in the literature propose building evaluation data sets that are partially or even fully composed of such synthetic data, meaning data that was artificially generated only for this evaluation task. So in our case, imagine it as questions and answers based on reports that an LLM would generate based on our request. At first glance, it sounds a bit like a chicken and egg problem, because I would be using an LLM to evaluate whether my other LLM setup works well enough on essentially the same task. But it helps to think of this approach sort of as the human taking over the retrieval stage. So me as the human, I would perfectly find the right text section in the document, feed it to the LLM, and ask it to create a question and an answer based on this text section. And after this, we can ask our RAG pipeline the same question, but ask it to look for it in the entire document without the help in retrieving the relevant section. And this effectively allows us to disentangle and evaluate the various stages of the RAG framework. And as such, this approach is particularly attractive because it does shift the main workload from the human to the machine. But it also has some downsides. It's, for instance, not fully clear yet if such synthetic data is even reliable, as I think our first keynote speaker also introduced. And I think he was very critical of it, for instance. And also this approach may also be only useful to evaluate certain aspects of a RAG, for instance, only the retrieval stage. Overall, I think this is also something that came up during almost all of the keynotes, that in very domain-specific areas, it is hard to evaluate your applications because there's often scarcity of relevant data sets. So once I eventually have my RAG setup running and producing satisfying outputs with consistency, I plan to scale up the analysis, and I'll keep this very short so I can have some time for reflections. In a nutshell, I think my RAG framework should be rather plug and play, meaning that I could rather easily switch it to other domains, for instance, instead of corporate disclosures, legal texts, or case law. Though in that situation, it might also be more complicated. For instance, with what Pedro just told us, that the ambiguance of legal text may pose significant problems for a RAG setup. And now, lastly, for the very important reflections on using AI to use AI, I mentioned at the beginning that I've been relying heavily on vibe coding, and that currently I'm effectively semi-blind trusting what coding assistants are giving me and producing on my request. I'm now sort of at the point where I can sort of tell what the code actually does, but I still need the AI to explain it to me and to confirm to me what is actually happening. And knowing this, I would love to hear your thoughts on whether you think this is a good scientific approach or if this is, good science. That's a question I keep asking myself, but I've yet to find an answer to. And moreover, relying on resource-intensive tools as coding assistants so much is also sadly ironic when you're working on sustainability topics, because you're using a lot of resources to just figure out what you're doing. On the other hand, the availability of such resources such as coding assistance and a lot of open source resources, codes, AI models, or data sets means that the barrier of entry to these fields is probably as low as it has ever been. You can get into this field rather easily, even with minimal reading of literature, just with these vibe-based approaches. Even though you do eventually reach limits, especially when you're trying to do a formal evaluation for an academic context, or if you're trying to scale up your application. But I do think that also regarding open source, and this is the last point, it is in itself also an attractive feature to rely on open source and free features, because you'll be less reliant on big tech, on AI giants, and also as a, I guess, nice side effect, if you rely on smaller models, which are typically free, you're also typically more sustainable because the resource cost is going to be less intense. And there we have it. Some reflections on using AI to use AI, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Now we are going with the round of questions, right? Can you confirm, Juan, how many time do we have? How much time?
So we're good on time.
Okay.
We're gonna have some questions. I'm gonna ask the people who gave the talks to join us here, and then we will close with some reflections. Danny, feel free to direct the questions, and I will just move the microphone around.
So floor is open for questions.
If no one has, Pedro.
Thank you very much. I thought it was very interesting, all the presentations. So congratulations, everybody. Well, given my background, my question goes to Rafael because of law. I am afraid that methodologically wise, I cannot be as helpful as other people in the room. But my question was about the data set. I understand that corporations need to keep the money for potential legal losses, so potential legal risk, also from sustainability in their annual accounts, and that must be reflected. And I don't know anyone that has analyzed that, probably because it's so bothersome to go through all the accounting. But that would be amazing as to how seriously they take it, because I do know of specific cases where it has been disclosed a particular corporation has withdrawn or kept money waiting to be sued for climate change and related topics. So I'm wondering whether you could include that in the data set, or whether it's to some degree in your corporate disclosures is already there, because that would be, I think, amazing and very interesting to us all, not only on what they say performatively in the corporate disclosure, but also where they put their money, which seems to me a more reliable measure. Thank you.
Should we take more questions and then answer everything? Or
Let him, Rafael can go, and then we will.
I mean, it's just a very brief comment. I think on the one hand, they either don't disclose it because there's a certain threshold in which they need to reach before they need to actually disclose something. Typically, it needs to be financial materiality. But if they do disclose it in the annual reports or the financial filings, it's definitely something a RAG approach could pick up on. I think the main issue in that case will probably be for the setup to be able to read tables. Because it tends to be highly structured in those PDFs. But in terms of it's definitely possible.
More questions?
Thank you so much to all the three speakers. Very interesting, your papers. I have a question for Juan, and another one, a second for Ismael. Juan, don't you think that your title, the title of your paper, could be perceived from another point of view as a little bias for the use of the adjective sectarian cooptation instead of, for example, religious? Because I was observing in the cover of Haddad's book you presented, sectarianism was put in inverted commas. So I think that ADATS explains the specific meaning, the specific acception he uses with this word in some paragraph of his books. So the question is double, which is this specific acception, and if in your title is implicitly accepted ADAT's acception of sectarianism. And well, I move on to the question for Ismail. Very interesting from a methodological point of view, your investigation. Well, in this case, it's just a curiosity about the document format. I mean, this list of slaves, why are they conserved? Are they enclosed, for example, in purchase contracts or other kinds of documents about the, I don't know, valuables of the characters you mentioned? Just a curiosity for the reason why they have been conserved in the archive of Simancas. Thank you.
I'll answer first. Thank you very much for the question. I agree with your comment on my title. It is true that the term sectarianism is very sensitive, and a lot of scholars try to avoid it, especially because it doesn't mean anything. It's too political, and everybody uses it in a different way. Sometimes it's referred to the hatred between doctrines and between religious groups. Sometimes it's referred to the relation between politics and religion. Sometimes referred to the instrumentalization of the religious groups in power survival. So it is very complex, but the term I use is not exactly the same. Because we have this on one hand, but on the other hand, we need to have some words in my field to work in with academic purpose. And sects are not the same of religious groups. There's some bibliography of this. For example, Asmi Bisara talks about sectarianism without sects, for example, or in the book that appears in my presentation, that is Understanding Sectarianism, especially explains that there are different dimensions of the sectarian identity. One of the dimensions is the religious identity, but as any identity, group identity, you have other dimensions. For example, transnational dimension, national dimension, subnational dimension, that would be the material dimension of the group. So depending on the scenario, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the relation between Sunni and Shia could have an important component of doctrinal, but maybe in Bahrain is more political, because it's more related with how it's enrolled in the political arena. And it happened the same in Iran or in Bahrain or in Yemen. It's different, the relation between the dimensions. So we need to talk about sectarian dynamics, and we shouldn't, in my opinion, be scared of using this term of sectarian dynamics, sectarian dimension of doctrinal, of transnational. So sectarian is a term that has an academic explicit value different than religious.
So thank you, Michele, for your question. I have to give a bit of context to answer the question. So slaves were very expensive. So the crown, Spanish crown, had needed to fiscalize somehow who was in the galley. But in the case of the Genoese squadron, this was particularly important because the Spanish monarchy had four main squadrons: the Hispanic Genoese squadron, the Napolitan one, the Sicilian, and the Spanish squadrons. Those were the four main squadrons. However, the Genoese had one particularity. All of them were under a regime of asientos. Those galleys were not directly administered, maintained by the crown. They were maintained by the private contractist in exchange of money, of course. So this kind of indirect administration of the galleys needed a special fiscalization by the crown. So at the beginning of the 17th century, they decided, Lerma decided that Genoese galleys needed to have this kind of slave list to control what kind of not only slaves but also forzati, the word, it is actually an Italian word, the condenados a galeras, and even other kind of personnel that was in the galleys. So it's just it was a way of fiscalizing the work, the activities in the galleys. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any more questions. Otherwise, we have come to an end. I don't know if anyone would like to share some thoughts, some feelings. Go ahead, Danny. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, this is a question for the panel, but I think that was something that was emerging through several presentations that may be interesting to discuss, which is for many of the presenters, AI has been a way of learning how to do other things. It's not really the method itself, but something that we use to get to the method. So, and I know that there is an increasing discussion on this in academic publishing, and I think that maybe this is an interesting space to discuss this, also as related to Ismail's point on students using AI and so on, which is basically how do we declare the ways in which we use AI, and what is the line between learning and letting the tool doing the job for us? I mean, this is a very abstract and general question, but I think that is, although a very important one.
Who wants to take it? Where is the limit between the scholar and AI?
We were talking about it during the lunch that we had. I think that in every moment of history, there's always appearing some new technologies, and those who take advantage of them usually adapt better to the new times than those who decide to reject it. So I think that in the academic world, we should be able to adapt to these technologies. The thing is, we need to have always in mind the ethical part, and until what point is personal, and until what point there should be some rules. I think that's interesting in the academic area. For example, for me, transparency is one basic. If you use AI, you just need to explain what parts did you use AI and how did you use it, and it's completely fine because it's a very interesting tool. And I think there's the point to start is transparency, but then until what point you can use it is more difficult, more deep. I don't have the answer, but I think we it's important to talk about it, and to people to think if maybe there is a necessity of regulation in this area is interesting.
So when I have reflected a lot on this issue, and there has been a lot of discussions about the ethical consideration of AI, and in my field, in history, what I ask myself, and when I ask the audience here, is what is the importance of the text itself? Because AI can. I agree with you. Like inevitable, the AI will be implemented in all kind of sectors, or also in our sector in producing knowledge. and we can use it in our methods. But what is the value of the text? Because we can see that in the coming years that some students or even some PhD candidates can make their whole PhD using AI and writing the whole PhD with AI. What is the problem about this? I don't have the answer, but maybe in the coming generations, people will not know how to write, and maybe that's fine. Maybe they will not know how to write, but they will know how to use perfectly the AI to produce a brilliant work, brilliant knowledge, brilliant research paper. But at least in my field, in history, I don't know. I'm quite skeptical about this, and unfortunately I don't have the answer that maybe professors can tell us something, because I think they're negotiating every day with AI with students, like they're like, you know, they're a primary source of how students are using the AI, and they have to see it every day. So I'm curious if you want to tell us your experience, or how do you reflect on this, and especially you that you're a philologist. So,
Michele, by allusions.
By allusion. Well, thank you so much, Ismail, for the question. But I'm quite sad because I'm realizing that I am the eldest of the group. So I have to answer to your question. Well, I will be very rapid. Of course, nowadays, well, I don't totally agree with Juan, because so far you're right. Always scholars have to compare their competencies with new technologies, advancing more and more advanced. Nevertheless, in the case of artificial intelligence, I think there is a great difference, because in this case we are speaking about a auto-producer form of intelligence, something not existing until a few years ago. It's true that nowadays, for example, in the academic environment, we have not specific and official tools for the detection and the discovery of use and application of artificial intelligence. On the contrary, we have many tools in order to discover hidden quotations, plagiarism, and so on. Nevertheless, a professor, a scholar, an expert of academic productions, trabajos de fin de grado, de fin de master, PhD, doctoral thesis, and so on. In my case, I have a very subjective and empirical impression. I'm able to discover if a text written by a student in reality is a result of the application of artificial intelligence, because this artificial text is absolutely boring, without errors, without great jumps of consistency, internal consistency, for example, and with a transparent order in argumentations, premises, development, conclusions, and so on. So the final result is something apparently pure and fine, but in reality very boring, and with very poor conclusions, very weak in the final argumentations of the contents. And why this? Because beyond the tools of artificial intelligence, there is not an epistemic and critical application of intelligence. So this artificial intelligence only apparently is an autonomous format of intelligence, because in reality is the re-elaboration of what is available on internet and big data and so on.
I don't know if I answered. This is personal.
Thank you. I would like to follow the logic of Professor Corney's statement, and I would like to share my own experience of working with the IA, and start saying that, in my opinion, at least the versions of the instruments that are accessible to me, they are not an intelligence, but the appearance of an intelligence. So it is a perhaps more complex and sophisticated version of the Raimundo Lulio's thinking machine, which is a mechanical device that produces sentences that can give the impression of sense, and perhaps make sense many times, but it is a sense that is mechanically produced, not produced by a consciousness. For instance, to illustrate what I'm saying, I'm working with a translation of a Byzantine Greek text. As a translator, at least Claude, which is much better than ChatGPT, as has been stated here before, it is useful in the discovery, in the recognizing of syntactical patterns. Sometimes when I am in doubt with a passage, I give it to Claude, and sometimes it is able to enlighten me a particular connection I missed. However, the content is very poor. So it helps me with the recognizing of the way the elements are in contact with each other, but the content, and when I, beyond the translation, when I that's an experiment I have done a couple of times. I give to Claude a text A and a text B. I suspect there's a relationship between two texts, and I ask it, do you think text A is quoting or alluding to or making any kind of reference to text B? It always says in the first place, oh yes, indeed, because it's very flattering. The first impulse of the machine is to reassurance the one who's asking the question. Then when I give it a more careful thought, no, sometimes it does not think. I mean, it, at least in the stage, in the technical stage of the instruments I have access, because I don't have any paid subscription. It does not. It is not a substitution for, let's say, natural thinking.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else has something to add. Otherwise, with this reflection, we're going to close. I'm gonna add as well on top of this. I think we're going to see things we don't know. It might be that this keeps advancing. I guess we all remember when ChatGPT was released a few years ago, and how dumb it was. and how then in just a few years things have sped up. Who knows how these things will keep evolving, if they do, or whether they will reach a point in which there will be a ceiling. What I would like to conclude as my final reflection on this is that whether a machine can do or stop doing or not be able to do whatever we do as humanists, as people that engage with things, with knowledge, is not the reason why we should do what we do or not. And I think this should be the core of it. The fact that a machine can do it or not is irrelevant, because we as humans need to keep engaging with our fields and need to keep unearthing the things that make us passionate, and that and engaging and creating knowledge can be something that a machine can do, but it is something inherently human. And I think if we stop doing it, we have lost to some extent our own humanity and our own reason of being. It's like when we're in academia, we know we are not going to be rich. We don't do it for money. It's not a rational thing. And we would not say, oh, if something else or someone else can do it, I won't do it anymore. We will still choose it because it is what we love. And I think that's kind of the meaning it has for us. So, well, thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have learned something. Thank you.